Hello, my name is Joe Slowick, and today we're going to talk about Caught in the Middle with You, examining the implications of adversary migration to midpoint collection and exploitation. So my name, as I said already, is Joe Slowick. I currently work as a threat intelligence analyst for Dragos, an industrial control system focused company. Prior to that, I ran the incident response team at Los Alamos National Laboratory and served as an officer in the US Navy. Been doing cyber stuff for about 10 years, and that has led me here today. So I'm doing this, though, not under Dragos, but really on my own through a side organization that I founded called Paralis, which is a threat intelligence training program that also does some security and intelligence advising, focusing on NetSec and standing up threat intelligence programs, as well as providing a tax vehicle for all sorts of sundry items, but that is not something we need to get into today. But ultimately, the genesis of this talk is, this was originally a Black Hat USA submission for 2020. I put this in before the plague got out of control. If nothing else, is a way to spend time in Las Vegas with a few thousand of my closest friends and whatnot. And the talk was rejected, which happens, no big deal there. But then around the time that this was rejected and within the coming weeks, there seemed to be an increasing trend of attacks and vulnerabilities announced in network devices that really went to the heart of the talk that I proposed. And it seemed very unfortunate that this idea would not get much of an audience, considering that there really isn't going to be much in the way of conferences for the foreseeable future because of the ongoing COVID-19 situation. So instead of letting this research languish and die in obscurity, I figured I have access to some tools through my little side company, and I might as well just stream and broadcast this and record it for posterity. So with that, we're going to talk over a few things today. First, to make sure that everyone is operating on the same page with the same definitions, we'll have an overview that will lead into some known examples and impacts of midpoint or network-focused attacks as an information security vector, moving on to current concerns, mapping to things that have just taken place within the past few weeks, looking at the late June to early July 2020 time period, discuss defense and mitigations, and then some future implications in both the policy and how we organize work and networks, and how that might impact this sort of threat vector moving forward. So first, the typical security view for most offenders is that we're really focused on the endpoints, those discrete items within our network, hosts, servers, other items. It's where we have our logs. It's where we have most of our tools. It's where most of our understanding lies. Maybe we have some conception and some control over devices in the network edge, such as firewalls or internal routers. But for the most part, everything beyond that is a mystery, something that is an ISP or a telco's problem, and not something that we can or should be concerned about. And we just assume that packets go out into the void and miraculously they get to where they are intended to go. Yet a capable adversary doesn't necessarily have this view. While a capable adversary will certainly look at a number of individual targets as being the ultimate locus of value and their desire as they launch operations, they also realize that there's a not necessarily uncontrolled, but certainly up for grabs space in between that may be able to facilitate operations in a way that is difficult for the ultimate victims to defend against, and can allow for exploitation at a larger scale than would be available through individual operations on a per target basis. So now let's discuss a distinction between endpoints and midpoints. Endpoints, like I said earlier, are where we typically focus security, clients, servers, and other items where tools such as EDR products, logging systems such as syslog or sysmon, as well as most of the visibility that we get pumped into SIMs and SIEMs and whatnot. We might have some visibility on some edge devices within our network, but lots of possibilities with a corresponding lack of necessary visibility exists for collection, shaping, and exploitation on the devices that stand in between individual endpoints. This could be both within a network, looking at internal network devices, as well as communication paths that traverse the open internet. So the options that we have from a midpoint perspective is that we can collect data, potentially at scale, if you have the right position and the right tools in place. And we can do this in a way that's removed from the specific endpoints in order to gather information in transit, which may be completely transparent to the victims and difficult to diagnose. We could redirect traffic in such a fashion that traffic to legitimate destinations goes to attacker-controlled items. This could be used to also further collection and then pass traffic on to its ultimate endpoint, but it could also be used to redirect things like logon portals and other items to facilitate credential capture, which could be used to then launch subsequent attacks on either the resources that someone was trying to authenticate to, or when done in reverse, to try to then breach into the network through remote logon portals. Finally, and most complex, we have the possibility of traffic injection. In cases where traffic inspection and alteration are possible without breaking communication, an attacker can potentially modify and inject code or other items in order to attack victims at a very interesting scale, and again, in a way that's very difficult for the ultimate victims to diagnose, since it's likely coming from outside an area that they control or have visibility into, and that can be quite profitable for a attacker to execute. So we should distinguish, as I've hinted a few times already, between a network perimeter and a true midpoint. So the defended network perimeter consists of devices that we have some degree of ownership over, whereas the uncontrolled midpoint are the third-party service provider items that certainly are quite crucial and without which we would not have networks in the state that they exist in now, and certainly not the public internet. But they also are areas where the defense of these items in themselves is removed from defense of these items as it pertains to leveraging access to one of these points, whether we're talking about ISP level or root DNS servers or important network infrastructure devices such as core routers, when they are leveraged not in a way to impact quality of service that a service provider would notice or acknowledge, but rather as a way to subtly attempt to impact follow-on victims where such attacks may be completely very difficult in order to diagnose precisely where they come from, and not necessarily a immediate problem for the service provider where the initial attack took place. So from the perimeter, we certainly have concerns about how to defend against these. So by definition, our perimeter devices will be publicly accessible to some degree. So it's not like we can just wallow in security by obscurity, firewall these things off since the items in question are actual firewalls. But instead, we can look at this, though, to try to at least reduce attack surface so that not everything is accessible, especially things like management interfaces and similar privileged accessibility features, and limit exposure to the greatest degree possible. In responding to or otherwise operating with these devices, we have to keep in consideration the nature of these devices as high availability, high throughput devices, such that when we start talking about things like an application delivery controller or a VPN gateway, or even a web server or similar software and hardware, that these devices perform vital functions typically that enable external accessibility. And unless we can predict or forecast network downtime to take something offline, we really need hot spares if we don't want to enable a loss of availability on our own as a result of trying to respond to, or even patch that requires a reboot options that may be vulnerable to an exploit or have already been attacked. But at the very least, such devices remain owned, operated, and managed by the organization so that we do have options to facilitate security and resiliency. Resiliency may be difficult as it involves doing things like failovers and spares and other items, but we at least have the capability to do things, even if they're very minimal in terms of scope and efficacy, such as making sure that we're at least logging access activity to these devices and potentially forwarding that elsewhere for analysis and storage. At the midpoint, though, things get a little dicier. So the targeted entities are not the ultimate victims typically. The ISP may be a valuable target, but in these sorts of attacks, it's not the ultimate intended target. Instead, the victims, which are impacted, but they are so indirectly because the ultimate victim where the actions are applied are disconnected. Well, they're connected to the ISP, but they're not a concern of the security program within that ISP, telco, or other service provider. So there's a mismatch in values, in drive, in concerns between these entities. And not only that, but whereas a service provider will be most concerned and most directly concerned with ensuring continued availability and quality of service, subtle modifications that allow for redirection or other items that are difficult to notice or difficult to diagnose, both at the ISP level and certainly for the ultimate follow-on victims, may pass completely by the wayside and may be very difficult to even detect or identify where they're coming from at that ultimate victim level, leading to a case where the available visibility between the two parties must be combined in order to try to figure out what's going on, but seldom is there incentive or even the ability necessarily to do so. The primary mechanisms impacting things at the midpoint, and these apply to edge devices as well, but we'll focus on true midpoint for the time being. So we have man-in-the-middle capture or redirection, so information capture or leveraging access to a device through which traffic flows to manipulate it and shift it on somewhere else. There's also man-in-the-middle and man-on-the-side injection. So in this case, either by controlling the route through which information flows or by having the ability to inject traffic on the side and beat the legitimate response back, we can try to inject malicious or non-desirable code into the traffic stream in order to facilitate exploitation. There are also changes in for traffic manipulation purposes, either at the IP route level, such as adding GRE tunnels or changing fundamental routing schema on a device, or through things like DNS poisoning and DNS record manipulation, which we are seeing an uptick of in the last couple of years. And finally, in a really difficult to defend against scenario, we can leverage insecure by design protocols such as BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, to hijack them in order to shape traffic to facilitate follow-on collection or manipulation by bringing traffic to areas that we manage or where we have implants and not worry about having to go out and land implants where the traffic we desire normally would reside. So first, an interlude on language before we pursue further. Now, currently, there is, to my knowledge, no widespread acceptance on any alternative terminology for some of these things, such as man in the middle and man on the side. These are gendered terms, which is problematic. But absent an agreed alternative that everyone understands, I'm at a loss for trying to come up with alternative terminology for these items. So just to make sure that there's no confusion on a technical level, in the absence of something, I'm not going to try to coin something new myself, since that would be rather presumptuous, but I will stick with these terms for the time being, although I strongly desire that we as a information security community can figure out some agreed alternatives that can emerge over time to move us away from items that may isolate or potentially even discriminate against, let alone offend, members of our community. Now that aside, getting into man-in-the-middle attacks, these are fairly simple to understand. An attacker takes up residence at some midpoint, whether at the network edge or in the greater cloud, a bunch of ISP routers, that allows the attacker to do something to the traffic which is flowing through that device, whether that's collection, manipulation, or if the traffic is amenable to inspection because it's not encrypted or unsecure in some fashion, to actually inject or manipulate it in some way to cause further harm. Man on the side gets a little bit more complex. In these cases, we try to identify traffic of interest, and this may require some degree of man-in-the-middle availability in order to flag items that we care about to begin with. Then once we identify something, through predicting traffic or identifying how a traffic stream will evolve, we can try to inject a malicious packet or packets into that traffic stream to beat the legitimate item on its return to the target in such a fashion to land, exploit, or other code that can lead to follow-on effects. DNS attacks are fairly simple to think about, simply changing or altering the name system that matches domains to IP addresses, but the options for doing so are quite legion. Whether it is spoofing or injecting a DNS response to a request, modifying internal or even external name servers, or standing up a malicious external name server that interludes within the hierarchy of DNS lookups in order to provide lookups to a malicious source. Finally, at the most complex sort of level, we have items such as BGP hijacking. In these cases, a gratuitous advertisement of BGP routes by a attacker-controlled device results in shifting the flow of network routing over multiple routers such that traffic is diverted from its typical or expected pathway in order to flow towards the one that the attacker desires. This could be designed to ensure that traffic is flowing through capture or injection points that we control without having to actually deploy those outside of network space that we have ownership of. So the overall attack strategy in most of these cases is first identifying the network accessibility of the victim in question. And then from there, we can try to figure out the key network terrain surrounding that victim where we need to establish points of presence in order to facilitate a follow-on network-based attack. From those, we can determine where to deploy intermediate tools to enable access to our objective and begin identifying paths to our ultimate targets. What specific routers or what intermediate name servers or what other devices stand between our objective and the internal network where we wish to be. We can then devise means to use infrastructure in order to gain access to victims through traffic manipulation, redirection, or even injection where that is possible, and use that to execute actions on objectives on the internal network which we otherwise would not have easy access to for a number of other reasons. This puts us in a state of the network where organizations need to extend the security perimeter and make sure we're including robust coverage of network devices, that the network edge that is typically in many cases left to an infrastructure or an IT team is now tightly wound to the overall security operations of the organization to ensure things like visibility, as well as making plans for incident response and remediation and recovery should one of those devices be compromised. But unfortunately, the risk doesn't stop there. Instead, it extends beyond company-controlled equipment to service and infrastructure providers over which we have little or no control and maybe even less leeway. The result is a situation where we have a disjunction between costs and risks, and they're distributed in such a fashion that may impede appropriate responses or work against timely information sharing in order to identify when these sorts of attacks are taking place. So we've talked about a lot of theoretical items. Do these sorts of attacks actually exist in the wild? Well, yes, and they've actually been increasing in frequency and in spread over the last several years. So to look at some examples, we'll talk about man-on-the-side exploitation kind of as an outlier for how this works, but to set up discussion on router exploitation as an example of man-in-the-middle traffic hijacking, moving into DNS manipulation and concluding with BGP hijack and the possibilities available there. So first, a disclaimer. This first example that we'll discuss includes information that was leaked as part of the overall Edward Snowden dumps. While the accuracy and veracities is unknown, and I cannot prove, nor am I saying that these are genuine, for the sake of argument, the technical details provided within these leaked documents, even though it cannot be proved as necessarily accurate, do seem technically feasible, and because they are now essentially publicly available, appear to be something that we as defenders need to be aware of, both for what it represents historically, as well as for the potential opportunities this might provide for attackers in the future. Ultimately, though, attendees that are accessing or viewing this presentation from a US or related government system are strongly encouraged to consider the risks and consequences of accessing potentially classified material on an unclassified system, as this may be considered a spillage, resulting in certain repercussions within your organization. So with that, I will give a couple of seconds for people to process that, and then we shall proceed. So quantum is a term given to a program that was disclosed as part of the overall Snowden leaks for what was called the NSA's most powerful internet attack tool. Yet for receiving these hyperbolic headlines, this program seemed to get significantly less attention than other items within the arsenal leaked by Mr. Snowden, including things like spying on foreign governments, which would seem to be the natural sort of activity you'd expect from a signals intelligence agency, as well as some of the domestic wiretapping and related programs, which is very unfortunate, well, potentially unfortunate, because based on descriptions, this seems like a very interesting and potentially quite powerful program. The concept essentially exists as an ability to observe network traffic in near real time, then based on the identification of certain selectors from an IP address to things like social media or account names, to flag these in order to initiate a man-on-the-side attack where the attack infrastructure attempts to beat the legitimate response to the requester with a malicious payload to enable exploitation. And what's sneaky about this is that because this takes place as an already initiated traffic stream, is that it looks as though it is just a natural or expected response to a user-initiated or identified as normal and benign sequence of network traffic. To put this in practice, this requires access to some degree of midpoint traffic in order to identify what it is that you're interested in trying to inject into in a timely fashion. Then from this, we need some either midpoint as possible or some external but nearby traffic site to shoot that traffic injection to beat the race condition back to the target. So this is obviously very capital intensive, but once it's set up, especially if you're really focused on specific geographic areas, the economies of scale are quite astounding because you can set up exploitation of entire regions of network geography from just a couple of ways of deploying this sort of technology and then allowing it to facilitate endpoint access for that region as long as this setup pertains. So looking at it in action, we have traffic of interest identified in transit based on some sort of midpoint access or other way of snooping on traffic. Once we identify something that we care about, the attacker-controlled device tries to jump the response and insert a malicious payload for the return that serves as an exploit to the client. The advantages to this is that this is a powerful tool to rapidly expand endpoint access across wide areas of network space rather quickly once this is set up. And based upon how it works, it can evade many client and network side controls to deliver a payload to a target as part of what appears to be a benign stream of network traffic. And once established, as again cited earlier, it's relatively cheap to maintain access and continued operations against multiple targets and ensures some really interesting economies of scale. But there are disadvantages to this approach. In addition to it being fairly expensive to set up initially, there is a question of speed. You either need to have a lot of compromised or owned infrastructure to make this work, or you have to prioritize on specific network geographic regions to make sure that both your interception and your injection capabilities are in place to beat that race condition back to the ultimate target. There's also the issue of traffic security, because quantum will fail as a concept if you're unable to either identify traffic of interest, or you're unable to break into the traffic stream because you can no longer predict either the traffic sequence or the traffic itself is hardened in some way through some transport layer security. Finally, the actual delivery of payload relies on whatever is requesting that traffic, some application, typically a web browser. So delivering that packet really requires there being some vulnerability to exploit or way to get code execution on whatever is ultimately receiving the traffic. Yet we've seen, thankfully, over the last few years, significant improvements in browser security, segmentation, and sandboxing that can minimize this threat or at least confine it to a relatively small portion of the overall victim system and make it far less harmful than it would have been just a few years ago. And really the primary disadvantage here is that traffic is increasingly encrypted across the entire internet. And this is going to be a theme through each of the examples that we cover. If you can't see something other than just at the very broad brushstroke metadata level, it really limits your ability in order to try to either snoop on it or try to manipulate or inject into it. But we do see other more recent examples than this quantum program disclosed back in 2013 that can try to get closer to this sort of technique. Although in these cases, we're looking not at the ability to sort of move forward certain network capabilities by implanting midpoint devices or setting up devices on the side to inject traffic into streams, but rather leveraging oppressive legal frameworks that require certain access to civilian infrastructure to facilitate both traffic snooping as well as the possibility of traffic injection. And we see this perhaps most clearly in the case of the People's Republic of China's Great Firewall, when combined especially with the Great Cannon capability as providing the ability to both identify traffic of interest and then facilitate the possibility of leveraging that traffic for malicious purposes. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But this moves us now into man-in-the-middle standpoints where we own the infrastructure in question. So this requires compromising or manipulating that infrastructure in some fashion to be successful. But once done, these provide powerful capabilities to inspect, shape, or redirect traffic given the privileged position of that device within the midpoint of sorting traffic as it goes on its way. And this emphasizes that disconnect between where effects are observed, initially at that high-level network infrastructure, and the actual victim, which is the one initiating or potentially receiving the network traffic, which is many steps removed from where the attack takes place. And the thing is, we've seen this increasingly. US CERT then, CISA now, noted a persistent campaign in early 2018 that they attributed to Russian state actors of compromising various Cisco devices, among other network equipment, in order to do things like setting up GRE tunnels and other modifications to shape traffic in such a way likely to facilitate credential capture by redirecting traffic to login portals to adversary-controlled infrastructure. Once a user was redirected to the malicious infrastructure, the implant would attempt to gather credentials from that user and then use them to replay to gain access to the victim network. Now, while that's one public example, I can think of many more, including specific examples related to that CISA alert that I've worked on, but none of these are in the public domain, unfortunately, and therefore we're unable to discuss them here at this point in time. I can say, though, that this 2018 alert is not an event in isolation, and more importantly, as we'll see when we start talking about some current events, it's not something that's gone by the wayside either. But ultimately, what we've seen in the case of midpoint hijacking or exploitation, we've seen things as simple as a denial of service in order to shut traffic off, or using the ability to identify traffic from a midpoint perspective to enumerate what's on the other side of it. These are interesting capabilities, but you can do this sort of activity far cheaper, far easier than trying to exploit a router. But getting more interesting, we've seen traffic redirection to facilitate items like credential capture, or redirection to malicious web pages that can provide some other function or capability, including manipulation for collection, and in certain cases, the possibility for traffic injection for exploitation, as long as that traffic is amenable to inspection and modification, which, if it's encrypted in transit, probably won't be the case. Router access certainly has advantages. For one, router security is still a iffy terrain. There's really no security tools, or certainly nothing like a EDR product or antivirus that's designed to sit in Cisco IOS or Junos or similar items. And most security personnel have little familiarity on how to investigate, let alone how to respond and restore to a potential router infection event. Furthermore, when we start talking about true midpoint activity, where we're seeing the effects delivered versus where they're taking place is completely removed from one another, which makes for a far more complex security response if there's ever a response to begin with. And then depending upon the platform and traffic, you may even enable complete control of the activity being monitored. This gets a little bit more complex and involves devices that are doing things like SSL inspection or traffic shaping, things like application delivery controllers, or again, SSL intercept devices. Typically, these are more network edge than they are true midpoint. But if you get access to one of those, the ability to pretty much do whatever the hell you want with network traffic suddenly manifests itself, as long as you're maintaining some reasonable degree of quality of service so you don't get caught. But that's an interesting point, because there are disadvantages to this approach as well. For one, there is a built-in complexity to how this works, in that attackers need to understand the platforms they're attacking in order to succeed. And thanks to vendor diversity, understanding Cisco iOS and Juniper OS, let alone things like Palo Alto operating system, other sorts of vendor-specific implementations of certain code bases, means that capabilities need to be developed for the specific product line in question and don't port over very easily. The result is that mistakes can be very costly. Doing things even to the degree within an individual vendor's ecosystem, applying a alteration or other change on a different version of a given operating system may result in completely unintended effects that can do something like take down an ISP accidentally, which means you've probably just gotten caught, at least incidentally. But there's also questions about load, because even though we have discussed how security is not ideal and it's difficult to investigate some of these ideas, at the same time, especially when we're talking about truly midpoint devices, these are items that are typically under very heavy load. Based on that, being very aggressive in trying to reroute or manipulate traffic may cause those devices to become overloaded and start producing an impact on quality of service, something that a service provider will notice quite quickly and take action on. So your actual ability to impact traffic may be relatively limited to only a couple of actions without compromising the device in such a way that people are going to notice that you're there. Furthermore, along the same lines, impacts on analysis need to be delivered very quickly in order to ensure the continued quality of service. A very limited subset of traffic that's flowing through a device may actually be vulnerable to inspection or injection, either for collection purposes or to serve up follow-on exploits, which adds further limitations to how this might work, especially when most of the network traffic in question is encrypted. DNS manipulation tries to get around some of these problems, not by trying to affect the traffic itself, but by trying to manipulate the address book by which the traffic is trying to direct itself. And we've seen several examples of this just in the past couple of years on hijacking DNS at multiple levels to try to redirect traffic from legitimate resources to malicious adversary-owned resources to facilitate an exploitation operation. DNS is certainly vital. We can't live without it, unfortunately, but it is fundamentally insecure as a protocol. It's clear text unless you're one of the entities that's moving towards DNS over HTTPS or other encrypted protocols, which is a situation that has its own set of problems in terms of ability to monitor and other items. But standard DNS, if you can look at it, you can see, if you can look at the communication link, you can see the DNS queries and start building out a pattern of life for your ultimate victims. From a security standpoint, DNS as a protocol emphasizes availability and redundancy over any aspect of security. While there are authoritative name servers which are reasonably well protected, the nature of DNS and its nested or tiered nature, from lookup on individual cached items on host through various intermediaries all the way up to that root server, mean that there are many places where an attacker could potentially either compromise or inject traffic into that lookup sequence to manipulate a response. And finally, while there is DNSSEC as a potential authentication mechanism, its enforcement is rare to non-existent, and there is no default authentication mechanism that at least ensures that you're getting a DNS response from someone you trust or someone that you would expect. And a really cool example of this sort of activity was put out by the researchers at Cisco Talos early last year, 2019, on an adversary called SeaTurtle, which is interesting for a number of reasons, not the least of which being what country SeaTurtle was ultimately assessed to be coming from. But leaving that aside for the time being, as it's not terribly relevant, SeaTurtle decided that, I already have access to your network, but I want to make sure that I can maintain that access and expand my reach pretty much at will. So in order to do that, after my initial compromise, I'm going to subvert your internal DNS lookups and change them so that lookups for legitimate services, especially items requiring authentication through usernames and passwords, are now pointing to a man-in-the-middle server from which I can start harvesting those credentials to facilitate follow-on or extended compromise. Lastly, most of the examples we've talked about so far consist of the attacker going to where the traffic is. So going to that midpoint and landing an exploit, going to the DNS service and modifying it or injecting into it. But instead of doing that, what if we make the traffic come to the attacker instead? And that goes to the heart of BGP hijacking. So in this scenario, what we see is an attacker leveraging owned network infrastructure or a way to broadcast border gateway protocol advertisements, leverages that capability in order to shift the identified most efficient route for the routing protocol so that traffic stops flowing in its typical most efficient path towards an alternative that favors infrastructure that we happen to want that traffic to flow through. We've seen many events like this, especially in the recent past, including instances where significant amounts of traffic, including from rather key services, such as social media, email, webmail, and even items like Department of Defense traffic in the United States, have flown through or have transited through, say, Russian or Chinese telecoms that they normally would never go through given the ideal or most efficient pathways, but because of route shifts as a result of BGP hijacking, were instead redirected to places where it's possible that traffic was captured en masse. Now, the utility of this is that we can start shaping and redirecting traffic without having any direct access to where we actually want to have effects whatsoever. This can really facilitate collection and monitoring and at really astounding scales. Depending on the infrastructure in question, you may also be able to enable further actions. This again depends upon the security of the underlying traffic that's being monitored or flowing through these devices and whether or not you can look into it, manipulate it, or inject into it. In the case of robust transport layer security, it's probably not going to be an option, but at the very least, you can still collect metadata and have lots of data waiting around for that point in the indeterminate future when the quantum computers come online and start breaking all of our encryption protocols. But there are certain examples where this does get a little interesting, where we look at cases like how China has deployed the Great Firewall and Great Cannon, that this has worked rather well, I suppose, if you're the Chinese Communist Party, less well if you're anyone else or a citizen attempting to get access to uncensored information from within PRC borders, that all network traffic flowing in or out of China, for the most part, has to pass through a node controlled by Chinese state authorities, the Great Firewall. But when paired with an active measure, especially when traffic is can potentially be inspected or modified, it enables this great cannon functionality, which has led to large-scale denial of service effects against things like GitHub, as well as the Great Fire website documenting some of these Chinese activities. So looking at BGP hijack as a way of facilitating network traffic access, instead of having to deploy many Great Firewalls, Great Cannons out into the wider internet, a savvy attacker can instead make sure the traffic is flowing through their own access points by shifting it to go across the Great Firewall, and then depending upon what capabilities exist for the traffic that's flowing through, then apply some effects in order to create chaos on the other end. There are limits to BGP hijacking, though. For one, it's very noisy and hard to hide. You're not camouflaging this or masking it. It's very obvious to anyone that's paying attention. And it enables imperfect alteration or inspection of behavior because, again, that encryption thing comes up again. Based on that, you can counter this sort of an attack, again, through robust security on communications that will minimize the impact of that traffic collection. There is the possibility that you can redirect traffic if you know the IP addresses in question from legitimate resources like logon portals to malicious resources for things like credential capture. But again, a lot of these items start to become very difficult to execute if there's transportation security in place. So where are we now? We've talked about a lot of somewhat historical examples. What do we have going on fairly recently, this being July of 2020? Well, the attacks and the vulnerabilities that enable them just keep coming. In fact, July of 2020 has been an incredibly difficult time for defenders trying to get their arms around these situations. But what we've seen, mostly from about the end of 2019 to mid-2020 so far, is an increase in +1 day or N+1 day vulnerability exploitation, focusing on network devices and network appliances. In these cases, we see a vulnerability disclosure in a high profile or very important sort of network device that could facilitate initial access or other capabilities. Then, thanks to either adversary reverse engineering or lazy adversaries taking advantage of industrious researchers that publish a proof of concept on GitHub, we see proof of concepts released within days of an announcement, and then attackers ranging from entities like APT41 to Pioneer Kitten, as well as most recently, as identified in reporting from the UK's NCSC, potentially APT29, leveraging these exploits in order to facilitate initial network access and follow-on actions against victim environments. And we've seen this against devices such as Pulse Secure VPN concentrators, various Citrix appliances, as well as Palo Alto firewalls and gateways. This activity goes back to 2019 and was weaponized by multiple adversaries, many state-sponsored, but also criminal entities as well that have leveraged items like the Pulse Secure VPN gateway vulnerability to facilitate initial access for the ultimate deployment of ransomware. Moving ahead to most recent events within the last couple of weeks and when I'm delivering this presentation, we've seen vulnerabilities announced in really critical applications such as Citrix and F5 Big IP application delivery controllers, and additional vulnerabilities for authentication bypass in Palo Alto network devices. The ADC items are of special interest because these devices, in addition to being high availability, high throughput devices that don't easily make themselves available for shutting down, patching, and rebooting, also enable almost full access to the traffic in question. So looking at ADC compromise as a potential attack point, the value here is less perhaps to target the entity that owns the F5 or the Citrix ADC in question than it is for clients that are communicating to items on the other side of the ADC, that leveraging the ADC's ability to inspect, route, manipulate, and potentially even inject content into the network traffic that's flowing through them to facilitate follow-on exploitation of the client environment in question. This can be done by injecting, say, exploit code into the network traffic coming back from the response, or redirecting network traffic flowing through the ADC from the desired location within the ADC owner's network to some attacker-controlled device that can either serve up, again, credential capture possibilities, or even redirect things such as spoofed software update portals to download malicious versions of legitimate software. And then we get into some really interesting examples when Juniper Networks in July released patches addressing several denial of service conditions within implementation of BGP on Juniper devices. Juniper devices are frequently used for high traffic volume applications like core network routers. And so applying a BGP denial of service that essentially results in the routing process to crash and restart can have a dramatic effect upon the functionality of the very internet itself. Granted, if you're an attacker, this might be shooting yourself in the foot because you're taking away the ability to have any further network impact on targets in question. But if you could narrow this or focus it only on a few specific targets, this does provide a way that you can start shaping traffic in such a fashion to facilitate collection, manipulation, or other items by selectively taking out certain paths within the overall routing framework to make sure that all traffic is flowing through the routes that you desire them to instead. So we've talked about lots of bad things. Are we at the end? Well, no, everything's going to be okay in the end. If it's not okay, we're not at the end yet, right? We still have a couple more topics to address. So what's to be done about this? How do we actually address these problems? Well, first off, from a network owner perspective, we have to secure our perimeter. We have to make sure that we have visibility in question that addresses these sorts of attacks. That means being able to identify suspicious activity to a controlled network device and ensuring that that information is residing somewhere where we can access it and where attackers can't easily manipulate it, offloading logs to a centralized storage or SIM so that we can actually either alert on these items or look at them in context of other alerts in order to try and figure out what's going on. But then if we do identify something, what do we do about it? What practices or procedures exist in order to respond to identified suspicious activity, and who's responsible for executing that response? As stated earlier, oftentimes, network security departments or personnel don't have the expertise to modify, inspect, let alone restore a compromised routing device. IT services personnel may have that expertise, but not have the security context to know what it is they're looking for or why they're doing it. So making sure that these relationships and exchanges and expertise are built up in advance is fairly vital to make sure that organizations even have the opportunity in order to make sure that they can respond to or identify what's going on. And finally, from a recovery standpoint, if we even identify that an asset has been compromised or modified, what do we do about it? Do we rebuild it from scratch? Well, that's painful, and because of the potential downtime involved, perhaps not even desirable. But do we have a last known good backup configuration that we could use not only for restoration purposes, but also for doing configuration diffing to identify what may have taken place? Also, if we have a really serious situation where we need to do things like take a forensic image of the device or analyze it in a lab, do we even have a replacement to take that device's place within the overall network schema so that we're not denial of servicing ourselves in the process? Device configuration audits can be very powerful in this schema because many perimeter-related infections focus on modifying those devices for traffic shaping or redirection purposes. An easy way to try and catch this is that if you're doing frequent device configuration captures and comparisons, you can start detecting when configuration changes make place. And if you have good change control practices within your organization, it should be a fairly easy idea or easy task to figure out when a change has not been authorized. In those fashions, we can, through a rather simple form of diffing, we can identify both when a change has taken place and identify when we have a last known good image to which we can restore in order to restore operations to a secure standpoint. Finally, network security monitoring comes into play too, because a lot of the activity in question here still needs or requires some degree of attacker communication in order to make it happen. And we can look for anomalous, strange, unique, or other communication flows in order to highlight potentially malicious or at least suspicious behavior. So examples of this include things like accessing configuration or administrator panels from outside of the company network or outside of known external regions where you expect this traffic to take place from, or seeing interesting traffic flows such as traffic originating from a device as opposed to going to a device, depending upon its functionality and how that might interplay with expected traffic flows and traffic patterns. And this gets into the idea that even if our visibility is relatively limited, even with something as limited as net flow, by based upon traffic type and direction, we may be able to identify all that we need to initiate a follow-on investigation, both by having a thorough understanding of what normal and good looks like, and then being able to detect when there are deviations from that baseline in order to trigger a network level response. So one example of how this might work out in practice is looking at DNS and having a pattern of life development based upon DNS record tracking. So we can identify DNS resolutions of critical importance to critical software suppliers or to critical services like Office 365 or Amazon EC2, and record and track what IPs or even ASNs get resolved as part of these records to figure out what is the corpus of expected infrastructure that these domains should resolve to. We can then look for and monitor for variations and changes in this and try to determine when we see new or unfamiliar items pop up that stray from the baseline that we created previously. When these are identified, we can then inspect them to figure out, is this a legitimate or understood change, part of a network change upstream, or use of cloud services or something else? Or is this an unknown or anomalous alteration that merits a security response and is indicative of something else going on? It is important to note that this is not easy to do. But if one is willing to roll up their sleeves and invest in the time, effort, and resources to make this happen, it could be a very powerful way of identifying victimized traffic that can allow us to then prioritize response remediation and detect things such as a successful credential capture attempt that we would otherwise be likely blind to until we see an attacker replay those credentials in their effort to gain access to our network. The midpoint dilemma, though, makes things a little bit more difficult because we have intrusions that occur at midpoint providers and the intended victims are dependents of that provider. There's a disconnect between who is ultimately harmed and who can respond to the issue in question. To combat this, we can look towards greater transparency, disclosure, and coordination between entities as a way of combating this. So ideally, we have some standards, agreements, or quality of service requirements that hold service providers accountable to notify impacted parties when a potential incident has occurred. Maybe that exists. Maybe it's something we should look into making sure it exists. If it exists, when identified, organizations can work to combine their different visibility or different perspectives on the issue to combine resources to investigate the item and determine what actually took place, to perform true root cause analysis when any individual party impacted by this is not going to have a complete picture of the incident. Through this communication, coordination, and increasing transparency among already existing commercial partners, we can enable a really robust defense and try and tackle this problem. Well, that all sounds really good and really friendly and awesome and sweet and whatnot, but the likelihood that that actually is going to happen is slim to nil. That's a very depressing way of looking at this, but I'm not going to hold my breath, and neither should network defenders either, that this sort of relationship will happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, encrypt all the things. Any traffic leaving the owned network must be secured. Once organizations no longer control the devices through which traffic flows, they can no longer assure the security or confidentiality of that traffic in question. Encryption not only ensures defense against snooping for that confidentiality defense, but it also reasonably ensures against things like manipulation and replay or injection that can give rise to further exploit opportunities like we talked about with man on the side and certain man in the middle attacks. So unless adversaries can break network encryption in near real time, they've lost. They can't win in this scenario. So based upon that, encrypt, well, maybe not all the things, but at least all the external things, because there are legitimate concerns for encrypting internal traffic. While some of these attacks can also impact internal devices, it is worth noting that visibility on an internal traffic also facilitates a lot of security visibility, such as identifying exactly what traffic is flowing from endpoint to endpoint and what the contents of that traffic might be. This also extends to ideas such as SSL interception and inspection at the network boundary to see just what traffic is entering and leaving the network. So encrypting other things may increase confidentiality of communication in the internal network, but it may do so at the cost of visibility and giving rise to other security problems and dilemmas. So organizations really need to pay attention to the risks and benefits of different communication security models and how they may differentiate between internal controlled networks and external uncontrolled network space. So we're good, right? We're fine. We've established defense, nothing else to talk about. Well, not necessarily, because we have some interesting developments, mostly in the policy and quality of life front, that are going to have a really big impact on a lot of these recommendations. First and foremost, the encryption debate has reared its ugly head again. Now, most of the public discourse around this subject, both, well, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Germany, as well as places like Russia, China, and other polities, has focused on endpoint encryption, especially in the context of things like mobile devices. But this debate is also extended into visibility for law enforcement and intelligence agencies, ostensibly for counterterrorism and law enforcement purposes, to network traffic as well, although this gets a bit less attention. The problem with this is that we've seen this return to the encryption debate that you might be familiar with from the 90s with its clipper chips and dual elliptic curve algorithms, which supposedly were backdoored or made intentionally vulnerable by certain parties, as we've seen encryption for overall network traffic rise above that 80 to 90% level, depending upon what traffic you're talking about, and certainly for most of the desirable traffic like email and social media platforms, it's not too surprising that authorities are gaining renewed interest in trying to break or forbid that very level of security. The thing is, though, is that law enforcement priorities can facilitate a lot of other nasty things. So while law enforcement requirements may demand for, let's say for the sake of argument, desirable reasons. We can debate that later. I'm not going to take a position on that. Or at least you can make an argument that it may be worthwhile to have a workaround for encrypted communication. The result is that you've introduced a flaw that anyone who finds it can take advantage of. To use an example, the TSA security key from a few decades ago now, maybe a few years ago now, it doesn't matter, where a single skeleton key for TSA approved locks in the United States. Someone took a picture of it, posted it in a newspaper, and based upon that, an individual was able to copy the key and facilitate access to all luggage and other devices that were using that supposedly secure backdoor mechanism. Well, the same applies for device security and for network traffic security as well. And furthermore, the risk doesn't just include data exposure, the loss of confidentiality, but also to the possibility for traffic inspection, manipulation, and injection in transit. Basically, as a result of weakened encryption and increasing adversary operations at the midpoint, we've facilitated capture and investigation where adversaries are increasingly trying to operate. This enables or restores capabilities that have largely gone away because of transport encryption, such as quantum or the Great Canon. These now become problems we have to deal with again, and they're problems that are typically best dealt with by that traffic security functionality because it's rather difficult and expensive to try and respond to it from an endpoint specific side. So the potential risks to end users are quite enormous. So we're really moving things back in time, not just in terms of a traffic visibility standpoint for law enforcement purposes, but from a security perspective as well, when we're in a not terrible position right now. But there's also social changes that are impacting how a lot of these discussions work too. So the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a radical shift in the workplace, especially for technical and digital work, where the majority right now of workers are operating outside of company premises and using personal networks in order to then communicate over the internet to company premises. And it's expected that even once all of this clears up, that about a third of the workforce will remain remote, at least for the foreseeable future. That means that the distinction between an internal and an external network has kind of gone away. And this ties into the idea of zero trust networks and other items where we can no longer be reasonably sure what our endpoints are, where they are, or what level of security they happen to reside in at any given point in time. So a simple bifurcation between internal traffic, okay, external traffic, encrypt, kind of goes by the wayside, especially when you start looking at how persistent attackers have been in focusing their efforts on items like VPN concentrators and other devices that make some of the secure aspects of this communication possible in the first place. Adding further to this is the increasing adoption of cloud services, including moving things like DNS, Active Directory even, as well as other services from on-premise installations into cloud-based infrastructure, which then requires traffic flow beyond the company-controlled network into third-party controlled networks, where our ability to identify potential hijacks or manipulations may be attenuated significantly or gone away entirely. So where are we now? Attackers are increasingly moving to midpoint or similar attack vectors because they've realized the advantages inherent in doing so. A combination of poor device security as well as government moves to potentially weaken transport security in the coming months or years is going to make this problem even worse. So we as network defenders find ourselves in an increasingly hostile and difficult environment to work in. We need to do something about this because the current trajectory is not only hazardous, but it's also unsustainable to continue operating as we have for the last few years. So while these aren't foolproof solutions and there's gaps in here, there are steps that we can start taking to at least reduce the size of the problem and start addressing some of the underlying issues. First and foremost, organizations need to extend security programs to the network edge and similar devices. Things that were normally left to specialists sitting outside the security team or rarely thought of in security terms for logging, response, or recovery purposes now need to be tightly integrated into security plans, including things like business continuity and operational resiliency, to make sure that defenders as well as organizations in a whole are remaining flexible and agile enough to deal with potential intrusions, focusing on these items. For the midpoint issues, at least given the current landscape, network operators and those implementing various network solutions and architecting infrastructure need to ensure that all traffic leaving the network is encrypted to some degree in order to evade collection or manipulation. Secure things to the greatest extent possible anytime something is going into uncontrolled space. But then to address some of the political items that are beginning to rear their ugly head that can throw all of this for one hell of a loop if they come to pass, we as the information security community and stakeholders in how these networks function must emphasize to political leadership the significant security costs of weakening transport encryption. That by doing so, we may facilitate some legitimate or potentially desirable interception of traffic to stop things like child pornography, terrorism, or other terrible, horrifying things. But the cost of doing so will be profound in that the very foundation of the internet, of the ability to communicate securely and reliably across distance, will be undermined and open to the possibility not only of interception for the purposes of collecting data, but also to manipulation and potential exploitation that can facilitate operations against network owners where they live, in addition to where their traffic is flowing through. So with that, this is a recording of a previous presentation, so I can't take questions, unfortunately. I hope this was very interesting. This is a topic that I've been looking into on my own for many years now, since before I worked at Dragos, going back to my Navy and Department of Energy days. If this is something that you found interesting and like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me, or on any other subject that you think I may be an interesting person to discuss with. So thank you very much for sitting through this discussion. I really appreciate your time. And with luck, when all of this passes through, we can have a good time and good conversation in person at some upcoming information security event.